Great. I'm excited. I want to be as incredibly human as possible.
Okay, well, consider that. That's what we do here.
That's all it is.
Yeah. So
I'm gonna have to name the camera, I
it
think.
is the future generation that
Okay.
you are going to be.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's good. I'm Dr. Steve Argue, Associate Professor of Youth, Family, and Culture and the Applied Research Strategist at the Fuller Youth Institute. A lot of times when I think about the scripture, I think about how the narrative of the gospel is intersecting with the narratives of adolescents and emerging adults and how they make sense of the worlds in which they live and the hope that the gospel proclaims. I'm going to talk about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. You know, one of the hardest things I think to do in communication is just to make sure that there's clarity between who I'm talking with and what they're bringing back to me. We just want to be on the same page. But you know what's harder than communicating with someone? Trying to step into two other people that are communicating with each other. And you step into this conversation and you're sort of trying to catch up, right? You're listening to the intonation, you're listening to the conversation. Is this funny? Is this serious? And should I say anything and contribute, or should I just slowly back away? Sometimes we step into these spaces and we're trying to figure out what's going on. I think about that with Paul's letters to the Thessalonian Christians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We don't really have the whole story. This is a couple of letters that Paul has written to the Thessalonian Christians. We don't really know the conversation, and we're trying to figure out what's happening in the bigger story. Now, Acts 16 and 17 gives us a little bit of backdrop. We know that Paul was in Philippi and he was beaten and imprisoned there, and he left that town and found his way south to Thessalonica. Now, Thessalonica is about a couple hundred miles north of Athens. It's in Greece, and Paul does what he typically does when he enters into a new town. He goes to his Jewish brothers and sisters and he begins to talk about the gospel. And for whatever reason, the Jewish brothers and sisters didn't seem to really resonate with the gospel, but the Gentiles did. They just ate it up. And what I love is that what Paul says in his letters to the Thessalonians, he says, look, we didn't just share a message with you, we shared our lives as well. It reminds me that good news shouted from the distance really isn't good news at all. The gospel is a message that is so bound up in good relationships. And so Paul has this deep relationship with the Thessalonian Christians. As a matter of fact, if you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you'll find that he uses the term brothers and sisters 22 times. Another way we can think about brothers and sisters is family. Paul's writing to his spiritual family in Thessalonica. And so this is more than just a form letter that he's sending. It's a deep personal letter that Paul is sending to people that he loves dearly. Now, these Thessalonian Christians really got excited about the gospel. And as their enthusiasm increased, they began to realize that all around the region, people were taking notice of their enthusiasm. And as the enthusiasm increased, so did the persecution. Now, we don't exactly know what the persecution was or where it came from, but it seems as though that there was some resistance to the lives that these Thessalonian Christians wanted to live. And so Paul was getting a little anxious about that. He wanted to know if they were okay. And what I love about his letter is that he wanted to know even more than that. It seemed like he gave them room and space to talk about how okay they really were. There was space to talk about their struggles. There was space to talk about their challenges. There was room for them to say things are hard. And so what I love about these letters is that they seem to be more than just a letter that gives a lot of advice or a lot of quick fix answers. It seems like they're letters that are filled with empathy, that creates space for them to be honest about how things are really going. And what I love about this letter is that Paul seems to point to a bigger narrative that these Thessalonian Christians get to live into. This narrative aligns with Jesus. And so this narrative in many ways is one that will also confront other narratives that have been part of our lives. And I think what Paul does is he says, look, these narratives affect us internally and externally. And so they affect us in a personal way, but then also in a social way as well. So personally, as I align myself with Jesus and Jesus' narrative, there might be ways that I all of a sudden confront some of the things in my life that aren't going the way of the Jesus narrative. So personally, I think about what it means for me to align myself with the Jesus narrative. And what if, as I do that, all of a sudden I'm confronted with the stories that I'm telling myself, the stories of guilt and shame, the stories of the ways that I hide personal parts of my life, the ways that perhaps I haven't dealt with some of the sin in my life. I feel the force of old patterns trying to get me off track from the Jesus narrative that I'm trying to live with my personal life. But these forces aren't just internal. There's also external forces as well. And Paul talks about this just as much, that sometimes in our societies, as we begin to align ourselves with the Jesus narrative and live out these convictions that we have, that we will come face to face with forces that we haven't realized before. So if I stand with Jesus for equality, I will feel the force of racism and sexism. If I stand with Jesus for simplicity, I will feel the force of consumerism at every turn and at every click of the mouse button. And if I stand with Jesus for compassion, I will feel the rage of nationalism and the rage of empire as I try to live and advocate for those that have less power than I do. And so there are these forces that are real, and yet there's a narrative that's even more powerful that we can trust in the gospel narrative. So how do we enter into this conversation that Paul is having with the Thessalonian Christians? How do we step into this letter? How do we let it spill into our own conversations? Well, maybe there's a couple of things that we can consider. First of all, Paul seems to really value the relational connection that he has with his Thessalonian family. And it really causes us to think about the relationships that we have. How am I not only living my Christian life individually and personally, but how am I also aligning myself with others who are also following Jesus as well? Perhaps we need to realize that Christianity is more than an exchange of information or ideas, but it's an exchange of our lives with each other. And maybe we can also think about the fact that Paul seems to give room for us to be honest about our struggles. There is an authenticity that he calls for in our Christian faith. You know, I work with a lot of young people that ask me all the time about different churches that they're thinking of attending. And they say to me, Steve, if I go to that church, will that church be safe? And what they're saying is not, will that church be easy? They're saying, can I bring my real self to this community? And will this community recognize me for who I am? And in the same turn, will this community be real with me so I can see them for who they really are? I think young people are looking for spaces where there's authenticity and real, especially in a world that seems so plastic and so virtual all the time. And what I also love, and maybe what we can keep in mind, is that there's this narrative that Paul calls us to, this Jesus narrative that's bigger and beautiful, more beautiful than one can even imagine. It's a narrative where life defeats death. It's a narrative where hope diffuses fear. It's a narrative where justice overcomes evil. And it's a narrative where grace, hope, and love win.